with the Lights Camera Pro podcast. A very special guest today, Shannon Martin of Podbean. Hey Shannon, how are you?
I'm doing great. Glad to be with you today.
It's so good to have you here because you are another podcast person who loves podcasts, and it's going to be fun to talk about podcasts. I actually was interviewing actors, directors, writers of it's an entertainment podcast, so people in film and TV. And I decided that podcasters were entertainers also. So I started doing a bunch of interviews with podcasters, and I've done several now. And it's so much fun because I love this whole industry and I love what everybody's doing. And it's just really cool to hear their equipment and how they promote it, and their stories of how they got started. And I interviewed a neuroscientist yesterday who has a podcast, and actors who have podcasts. So it's very, very cool. The whole podcasting thing is awesome. So we're going to go in a second and talk about it, but let me get through these couple of ads first. This is, let's see, let's get started. This is Restream, and Restream will take your live broadcast and send it to several places at once, like I am today. It also has a live studio, which is very cool. It's a very cool product. I'm using it right now, so I do not have to post to several places and repost, and it goes to all the places at once, kind of like my hosting service, Libsyn, sends it to 14 different places at once. So it saves a lot of time. It's a great service on the Facebook and YouTube lives. I have a referral link to Restream, and then you can see on the other side of the screen with Shannon, there's a logo for eCam. I'm using eCam Live, and there is an affiliate link on the broadcast today if you want to check that out and see what eCam Live can do for you. You can add graphics, you can add video. I have a composer on tomorrow. I'm going to add a piece of video with a film that he did that he scored, and I had an actress on last week, and we're showing clips from her movie. So it's very cool. It's like doing a TV show. And that's it. Those are my ads. So I'm done with those. So we could talk now, Shannon. So many questions, but you were around in the very, very beginning. You were around when podcasts were on iPods. Tell us
I
about
was
that.
okay, you're making me feel old now. I was around in the beginning of time. Yeah, I started listening to podcasts on an iPod back in the day. I mean, back then it wasn't like a connected device. I was like, putting the USB into the computer
Right.
and downloading and the whole thing. And yeah, I guess kind of how I got into podcasts was because I listened to NPR radio a lot, and
Okay.
they sort of started repurposing things. And at some point they made original podcasts also, but they repurposed a lot of their radio stuff. And so I would, listen on commutes, but then, that's available when it's available. And then there'd be these periods of time where the stuff isn't. And so I think that's kind of how I got into it. And then one of the other early podcasts I listened to was a podcast called The Amateur Traveler, somebody that's still going.
Wow.
I don't know how many episodes he has now. I was actually interviewed on it once years ago, but covers different places, and so he's been going for quite a while. But yeah, back then I used to take my iPod out on my walks, and that kind of stuff. That was my main thing, and it's the same now. It's just a lot easier nowadays.
Right, right. So this is, God, I have so many questions for you. They'll never end. We're just going to have to stop at some point. But so audio podcasts are very intimate, right? You don't see the person, you're talking to them, but you're kind of like inside their head. Sometimes I even close my eyes when I'm interviewing someone. It's very different than this. And I was an actor for 10 years, I had a theater, and I've done short films. And I love this. I love the live thing, and I love the video thing because I can see people's faces and the reactions and just sort of feel them out quicker. It doesn't take as long to figure them out. You're kind of listening for cues and trying to figure them out. So I understand that Podbean has a live service now, or part of their hosting. So first, let's just tell people
Yeah.
what Podbean is. It's a hosting service.
Yeah, we're a hosting platform and we have so many different things going on. So we're kind of pretty innovative in the space. We've been around for over 10 years. So we're one of the old players in the game. But I think we kind of have that longevity, but yet we have a real innovative team. So we always, when we try to encapsulate what we do, and it's very hard because podcast hosting is sort of our where we started, but we also have a very popular listening app. So we have about 1.5 million active users on our app. So people use it like they would use the Apple Podcast app or Spotify or any of the apps out there. And that has all kinds of features, like it has a recorder, an audio recorder built in where people can actually audio record, edit, and publish right from their phone. So we did that a few years back. And when it's always interesting because, like I said, the team is very innovative. So when they came up with that was the only one really out there that did that. Now it's not completely uncommon. There are some others out there. But just last November, I guess it was, we launched live streaming on the app. And basically all of the things that we launch, all these innovations are either, our ideas our team comes up with working with podcasters, but a lot of them, of course, come from this interaction with podcasters. And the live streaming was because there is this intimacy to that live in the moment type of thing. The engagement that podcasters often have an issue with because they'll say, I have this podcast. I know I get 1,000 downloads an episode, but these are sort of mystery people to me. We never have any actual interaction and they don't leave comments and they don't, so this was a way to help them build the engagement. And in our particular case, it's an audio only live streaming. And that was built because we work with podcasters. We want them to have a tool that is an additional option for streaming in a way that's more geared towards podcasting. It's very simple. If they aren't used to doing video and they don't want to, it gives them something that maybe they have more of a comfort level with. Also very easy for the audience members to call in and guests to call in, just using an app, not necessarily needing a lot of bandwidth, not needing to worry about, the video production and that kind of stuff. So it's just another one of those tools they can use. So it's been pretty successful.
Very cool. And do you see a tendency in the industry to go towards the video podcast? I know obviously Joe Rogan has the YouTube channel that's huge, and Bill Simmons used to have a show on HBO. I don't think he does any video anymore. But are you seeing people saying, okay, we have to have this, but also this now?
It's a mixture. What I'm seeing more is people coming in by doing video, and then they kind of use the word podcast and sometimes they aren't doing it also as a traditional podcast, but it doesn't really matter, right? I mean,
Right.
They can call it whatever they want. So I'm seeing more kind of the opposite, less traditional audio podcasters necessarily adding on a video podcast, but I am seeing more podcasters doing live streaming, like this, like what you're doing right now, or Podbean Live, or something like that. So a lot of people are adding that on, and I think that we saw that when we started doing this, like in November. It already had been growing, but of course, this pandemic situation just brought that to a different level because a lot of podcasters were like, okay, I'm doing once a week podcast. Maybe I have a Facebook group that's pretty active. But, maybe I have maybe more time on my hands or maybe less, but more desire to, I'm alone. My fans are alone. We want to connect more. So it kind of spurred a lot of people on, I think, towards, adding that piece to it. So I'm definitely seeing a lot more podcasters that do some form of streaming, either as sort of integrated with their podcast or as a sort of a separate thing to connect with fans.
Right, and I that was my biggest problem. My biggest problem is I was using Clean Feed actually because all my podcasts are remote. I don't have a studio. I have some friends I interviewed the other day who have a studio here in Atlanta, and I was thinking about doing that, but honestly, to get there and get people there and set now you're talking 3-4 hours a day instead of maybe a half hour prep and an hour record. And also, I've been thinking about, tell me what you think about this, but I've been thinking about adding a co-host because this is more like TV, you know what I mean? Because you can show a clip from a video. It's almost like, an interview on Jimmy Fallon or something like that. And Also, I'd love to have people call in eventually and then see them when they call in. So I've had some comments in the comments section that are asking specific questions of the guest, but then it gets tricky later on because I show a clip of someone's film that's a minute and a half, and then I'm turning it into an audio podcast. But that's why I have this thing called, and I'm not endorsing this, but ECAMM call recorder, and it records the audio separately and does split track, so I can make it into a high quality podcast. There was a guy in the UK who called on his phone, and I cannot use his podcast because he was outside. He was on his phone. We could barely hear him. But most of the podcasts I can use, and most of them are audible, is the correct word. So I want to talk about conferences with you. I'm so excited to talk to you. This is like free advice. Because, I mean, you're the director of communications at Podbean. You're not just another, I mean, not that it's bad to be another podcaster, but you're working at the company, right? So conferences, you've gone to a lot of conferences. We talked a little bit before we went live. What is it? Just tell me about the few conferences that you went to, Orlando, DC, the podcast movement one, what the differences are. One is huge, one is small, how it helps your company.
Yeah, podcast movement, I think, would be the first one that I went to, and they've been going for quite a while. I actually went, the very first conference I went to there was a thing that was sort of at the same time as NAB, the National Association of Broadcasting, out in Vegas. There was New Media Expo. And that year they did it a bit different, so it was kind of, and then the next year it kind of failed. So, but I met a lot of podcasting people at that. It was podcasting and a bunch of different new media at one place. It was a sort of a blogging section, podcasting, and actually in video, and a lot of people that crossed over. But podcast movement, we went that first year, and Podbean had a booth. And then we've gone every year since, and I think it's still the world's largest conference, and people do come in from all over the world. It's always been held in the U.S., but it moves around. So it's been L.A., Dallas, Florida, Chicago. It's kind of, moves from, and now this past year they did two. They did the normal podcast movement, and then podcast movement evolutions, which was out in Los Angeles in the beginning of February, I think. And that was meant to be sort of slightly different. I think it ended up sort of attracting more of a West Coast audience, but it wasn't necessarily meant to be a geographic thing. It was meant to be what's changing and trends and that kind of stuff in the industry. Right. But that also had a pretty good crowd. And then there's a lot of regional ones. PodFest is the one that you mentioned in Orlando, and they've been in Orlando and the Tampa Bay area thus far. But it also attracts a pretty international crowd, and it was big this last year. That was actually sort of the last conference in the world because it happened February, like right before everything shut down.
Right.
Pretty much. We all went to that, and that was the last we saw of each other. So that one is really growing. They're actually doing a really exciting thing. They have a Facebook group. I think it's called PodFam, but they're doing a virtual event for a week in August. I think it's, if I'm not wrong, it's the 10th through the 17th, and that is they're trying to set a world's record for the most people ever attending a virtual event.
Cool.
So they kind of always go big or go home. Like PodFest I was there when they were small, but I know the people that run it. Chris Komitsos is one of the guys, and he really is entrepreneurial events like go-getter. So it's an exciting goal to go for, right? If nothing else, and it really puts podcasting, on the map as this big thing. So that's exciting. There are a number of regional ones. More so in the U.S., but also across the world. Like we are actually sponsoring, it's now a virtual event, but we're sponsoring Audiocraft in Australia in July. I would have been going to Australia, and I think it was originally in June, but instead I'm going to join virtually, which is not nearly as exciting as going to Australia. But DC Podfest is really cool. But, this year they're all kind of some are going virtual, some are putting it off till 2021 and seeing what happens. So it's a variety. In Atlanta, actually, last year, I guess that was, Atlanta had one which was She Podcast. So that's also a kind of a specific niche, although you don't have to identify as she to go to it necessarily. But it's obviously focused on, female identifying podcasters who, sometimes there might be specific kind of issues they want to talk about and stuff. And it was a really, I personally didn't attend that one because of time last year, but we did sponsor it and were involved. And it was really, the atmosphere was great. The regional ones, even when they're regional, sometimes they pull people in from different places, but they kind of, a lot of times, all have their own feel. There's another one that takes place typically in New Jersey, and it used to be called MapCon, but now it's ICON. It's like independent podcaster conference, and that one is doing a whole lot of virtual stuff right now. Joe Pardo, the guy that runs that, is really also a great guy, and it's a really warm kind of community. So the DC one, they get a lot of DC-based podcasters, and so there's a little bit of a niche sometimes in like politics and that kind of thing, but you see a variety. A couple of years ago, I remember I spoke there, and I remember they had a lot of they had sort of a track or a focus on advocacy and kind of, using podcasting as your voice to make change and that kind of stuff. And they had some really interesting speakers. So there's so many events, and there's a lot of meetups in different areas too. So even if it's not, and again, maybe they're virtual now, but even if you aren't going to a big conference, is a lot of networking, that can other podcasters too.
Right. And the one in Atlanta, the She Fest, is that what they called it?
She Podcast.
She Podcast. Was that in a convention? Was it kind of smaller, in a hotel, or?
It was in a hotel, and I cannot remember what the numbers were. It was pretty big for a first-time conference. And they were scheduled to be happening in, when were they originally scheduled? They were scheduled sometime, maybe around now, and then they pushed back to October. And they just announced pushing back till 2021, I think. They don't want their thing to be virtual. It's not because I'm putting words into their mouth, but from what I understand from what the organizers have said is that, they love virtual stuff, but they want theirs to particularly be the in-person component. So they're going to wait until they can do that. But they were planned to be in San Antonio or something this year, somewhere different, not in Atlanta this year.
Okay. And can you roughly say the numbers of people that you think are at these conferences? Or are you talking about like 10,000, 50,000?
No, not 10,050. I think podcast movement is getting up to maybe close to 5,000.
Okay.
A couple thousand maybe at Podfest. And then the regional ones are all much smaller, like a couple hundred, that kind of thing, which I find is kind of nice. Even the biggest ones, it's still more intimate than probably a lot of, huge expos and that kind of thing. Not as overwhelming. I feel like there's a lot of the benefit of it is the conversations between podcasters, and it's very easy to, like, the big name speakers, you very often can have an opportunity to talk to them. And I know you interview a lot of celebrities, and to me, podcasters are celebrities, so I'm always following them around.
Okay, wait, we have to stop. So who are some of your podcasters that you would like to meet that you haven't met?
Oh, that I haven't met.
Or that you have met.
Yeah, I haven't. Well, I haven't. One that just like a big is Ira Glass.
Okay.
And he's like, and I met the team. I think it was a couple of the members of the Pop Culture Happy Hour. It's another NPR one. I met them at one podcast. I went up to them when they were speaking, and I think the podcasters get a little freaked out by that because they're used to being, behind the mic.
Right.
So they're like, "This is strange. I didn't know I had fans."
Yeah.
But I've met a lot of independent podcasters who also really don't think they're going to have a fan base, and so they really like, when someone's geeking out over them. Who else would I like to meet? I don't know who else.
Well, you can think about it.
That's Ira Glass would definitely be the.
Yeah. The biggest celebrity that I guess I'm going to interview her next week is the lead actress from Hairspray. But just so many like independent film actors and directors and writers, and to hear what they're doing. There was one art director who works on Christopher Nolan films, and he's working on the new Rock movie for DC Comics. He's working on huge movies, and he worked on The Walking Dead. His name's Justin O'Neill Miller, but he also makes short films and wants to make an independent feature. So it's just very, I mean, I have always been, I've done year number 46, interview 46, and I am telling you, I've never had a boring interview. Everyone surprises me. It's just like human beings, right? Everybody's got their own story, and it's completely compelling to me, everybody's story. So you have spoken at a few conferences. Can you talk about what that's like? And I saw one where you're talking about monetizing. I know Podbean does a kind of a special thing with it's integrated in the app.
Yeah, we have basically any way that you can monetize a podcast. We don't really have we don't have merchandise directly, but otherwise all the other ways you can think of to monetize, we have everything from selling content, like premium content where people pay for it, to a patron program that's built in. Our live streaming has a monetization component where you can charge for tickets, or you can also get gifts from your listeners. So they like click on this little, cup of coffee, buy you some roses, and those equal money for you. So we have that, and what am I leaving out? Patron, advertising, the biggest one. We have two different things with advertising. We have a marketplace where people can match up with advertisers, so not bringing their own, but actually, connecting with someone. And then we have pod ads, which is to dynamically insert your own ads. So if you had an advertiser, you can insert them and run them to certain geographies and time frames and all of that kind of stuff. I've spoken about that at a couple different conferences, I think, and also some sort of virtual events. And then most recently we spoke at, my colleague and I spoke at Podcast Movement Evolutions about our live streaming and just about streaming in general, and what podcasters, why they might want to do it, when they might want to do it, ways they can use it. Because we were even discussing the fact that, like your show, it's very obvious. It makes sense. It's cool for people to be able to join in an interview. But some people do a very scripted, like a true crime show or audio fiction. They think, well, live streaming, no, it doesn't fit me.
Yeah.
But then what we were discussing is, but if you have the show that has a huge fan base, what about an AMA? What about getting into how you do the research and how you, so your live streaming might be very, very different.
Right.
But
it might accompany it, but not be the actual podcast. Yeah, I interviewed, I don't know if you know this guy, he's pretty popular, Eric Carter Landon from the True Consequences podcast, and he does true crime in New Mexico, and he does that. He does these scripted series that have music, and we're talking about a murder and solving the murder, and there's all this eerie music, and it's almost like a Dateline episode for your ears. And I used to do a lot of features for TCM and the NBA, and I understand how that works, and it's a lot of work. I mean, this is me interviewing you for an hour, a little prep before, a little post after, but I mean, this is just hours and hours going into research and scripting and doing multiple takes. It's a lot of work. But very interesting stuff. And then he's part of this Oracle network, and there are all these podcasters who do true crime, and then he has like Q&A live sessions where they're not really fans, they're more like people who have had cases that are unsolved, or they're interested in this true crime stuff. I mean, I guess some of them are fans, and they come with questions and ask him questions about a certain case.
Yeah, that's a one. I think those kind of podcasts and audio dramas, I mean, the work is incredible. And people will say, like, true crime, it's so popular. And man, and they're often the ones that, draw in the advertising dollars and stuff. But I mean, the work they put in, they should, they should. And people and the fans of true crime are like rabid fans. I mean, they're really, they consume. So if you listen to one true crime podcast, you don't just listen to one, you listen to many. So,
Right.
Yeah, so that's so we talked about the live streaming most recently, and then we have a different sort of product at Podbean which targets corporations and big organizations with private podcasting. So using the same medium we all love, but just targeting internal, like employees. And so that's been sort of a specialty of ours for a few years now, and very sort of separate business in a way, because you obviously won't find these podcasts on Apple Podcasts or anything. But that is sort of a separate conference thing too. So I spoke at a conference in January for a group of training and learning development professionals, and just did another, well, it was a recorded session, but for one of their virtual events. In March, I guess that was. And so it's fun because it's a very different group. It's not the normal creators, that I'm used to kind of working with, but these people are also creators trying to create some interesting programming that employees won't, fall asleep on,
Right.
and using storytelling. And so a lot of them are incorporating podcasts more and more into what they're doing, especially for teams that are all over the world or people that travel, sales teams and that kind of stuff. So using podcasting for that. So that's been also an interesting, so we kind of have these two separate tracks that we do with, kind of your everyday podcasting and then your sort of training, HR, corporate folks.
Yeah. So I used to work at Warner Media, and their podcasting network is literally like 4 or 5 years old, and it started with nothing, and now it has like 18 podcasts, and they have a couple of the internal ones on there about being in the building or working in post-production. But this woman, Angela Carone, she was a producer for TCM, and she moved over to being the director of podcasts. So these are new positions that are happening at these companies where people are managers and directors of podcasts, and she runs 5 or 6 podcasts for TCM, and one of them is like this serial series. It was about a director, I forget his name, but it was there were news stories, and they were building up this whole scene, and it debuted at number 3 on Apple True Crime Podcasts. Like huge audience, like from the get-go. But like you said, almost like a short film, like an incredible amount of people and resources go into making these things, which I think I would enjoy working on also. For sure. There's something different about looking at a screen that's just audio and telling a story, and looking at a screen that's audio with video. Like I've been doing it for years, and it's just different. And I like it's somehow more focused or something. I don't know how to explain that.
Yeah, there's some research behind that too that says audio is one of the best ways for people to take in and recall information and feel more intimate with it. I think that's why there's a lot of research about podcast advertising and its effectiveness, and I think that's got to be why, because when we're and I mean, I love video too, but when we're looking at a video and doing this, it's two senses. Our mind is kind of split, and I think I had a friend, and what she said to me is, I was talking to her about this, and she said, this makes sense because when I think of when I was younger and like listening to radio, I still remember some of those stories a lot more, like the details and the voice. And so I think that's where that can come in a lot. And it's just, for me, the other thing, podcasts that I like about audio podcasts is that I pretty much strictly listen to them when I take walks.
Right.
So it's a walking exercise thing. So it's just a different point of consumption. In the past, it was mostly commuting for Americans, but a lot of people aren't commuting anymore.
Exactly.
So at first during the pandemic, the listening went down a little bit. It was sort of like for us, what we saw, it was pretty even, but different podcast apps and different hosts saw different things, and there was some decline, but it pretty rapidly kind of ramped back up, which was interesting because at the same time there were a lot more podcasts being made. I mean, the growth in new podcasts has been unbelievable this
Right.
past year. So it's kind of like it is getting more and more difficult, as far as the competition out there. But fortunately, the listening kind of leveled off. But at first, there was that drop because people's normal pattern was interrupted. So it's like if I'm used to listening on my commute to and from work, it's not that I'm going to stop listening to podcasts, but I kind of find a new space for it in my life, and I think people have settled in with that. So.
Yeah, I did the exact same thing. It was commuting at first, and then it's walking the dog now, or sometimes being at the gym. But so, Shannon, where do you see podcasting going in the next year? Do you think it's just more of the same, or is anything different going to happen, or is it going to explode? Because I feel like, and I've had conversations with other podcasters about this, I feel like podcasting is the new website. So every company had to have a website.
Yeah.
They had to have a Facebook page. Then they had to have a Facebook page. Now you have to have a podcast. And the idea is, I think it's something to do with the audience is more affluent or something like that. And they're 35 to 55 and have a certain amount of money or something like that. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, I definitely would agree with that. I think it is becoming companies and also like celebrities, and I mean you see the evolution of, you're like, oh, why does so and so think they need, it kind of initial reaction is like, why does so and so need a podcast? But they see that they do. So I think it's part of that media mix. And I think with a lot of this stuff, it's often not that one thing replaces the other, because like people will say, oh, is blogging dead, or email newsletters, they've been dying forever, people say, but
Right.
still, if you're in marketing, it's still like one of the best tools.
Yeah.
And so it's just people might consume it in a different way. I mean, it might have been that they read it more in the past, but maybe you still need to have it for branding and some contact and owning your list. And I think with podcasting, it's a different piece of that mix, and it is going to hit a different audience sometimes, and hit them at a different time sometimes. So again, I'm going to still follow certain companies and get their email and their blog, but then I might have more of a connection with that celebrity or that company by listening and feeling like I have. And there's really cool things going on with branded podcasts where companies are making podcasts where it's not just them talking about their company. It's just in some way related, but it's a really fascinating topic, and it's very sort of subtle marketing, good branding, staying sort of at the forefront. And so, yeah, I see that happening a lot. And then there's a lot of consolidation in the industry and a lot of changes just because we're at that time, sort of. So I imagine there's going to be a lot more of that. A lot of us. I feel very fortunate because at Podbean, we've always done so many different things. It's been sometimes difficult to say, what do we do? Because we're always doing all this different innovation. But I'm really glad that that's the case, because I think it's kind of, there's not going to be a lot of, companies that are just doing podcast hosting and not doing a multitude of other things, because podcasters need all these different tools. A lot of the companies are now doing sort of hosting and an app and also producing. We haven't gotten into that yet, but that's, you're seeing that kind of thing more. So where they're kind of multi-level, they have an advertising arm, you have to kind of bring all these pieces in. So.
Yes, I did see that. There's this group called Resonant Recordings, and I just got a message today because I'm on their mailing list or something saying that they're going to do hosting. And I'm like,
Yeah.
really, guys? Like, this is a I guess you call it a post-production house for audio. And they do the podcast and they submit it and tag it and do all the things that they do with it. Even do some promotion, and they have training. But now they're going to host. It just seems like hosting isn't something you can just kind of add on to your company's website. Like for example, when I was looking at podcasts, Podbean was it was Podbean, Buzzsprout, and Libsyn, and and I just literally had lists of things and made the decision based on some podcasts that I knew and some podcasts that and some information that said that they were around for a long time or something, because I didn't want to hop around and go to multiple sites or whatever.
Right,
But yeah, it's very bizarre to think that you could just add like a little hosting service and people would sign up. I mean, I guess if you're doing it all together, but it seems like hosting is very
Yeah, I
complicated.
think that, I mean, yeah, it's, thank you for saying that because I think people don't necessarily think it is and they don't know why it should cost money or what's involved. And they're like, oh, bandwidth is so much cheaper nowadays. But it's like there's so much behind the scenes to keep it up and running 24/7 smoothly, to go out to potentially millions of people all across the world, and to do customer support with people that, like yourself, that does video editing and knows a lot of stuff about technology, all the way to someone who literally never listened to a podcast before and decided to start one.
Right.
I mean, we have the gamut, so we have support team that has just grown and grown over the years. We have a listening app. So on our support team, we have to have not only, the people that are dealing with podcasters, but the people that are dealing with people that just have an app and are just listening, and they have totally different questions.
Right.
So it's kind of complex. And then on our side, since we have this private podcast hosting, that is a very different business line as well, because that's all about security. The requirements are quite different. We go through reviews with, a whole corporate team. And, our typical podcast hosting service, you just do what you did. You do your research, you go online, you buy a plan, there you are. And then we have webinars and we have all the tools to, help you. But with a corporate client, it's a very different onboarding process over a number of months a lot of times. So yeah, it's a sort of a complicated business to run, but it's a lot of fun.
Right. And do you see the television industry is sort of pulling back, and they're not hiring and they're freezing positions? Do you see an explosion in podcasting? Do you know anybody who's looking for a podcast editor / producer? No, I'm kidding. But I mean, you know what I mean? Is there lots of hiring going on and expansion because there are so many podcasts?
Yeah, there's a fair amount of expansion going on. So I think we were talking before about some of the newsletters that come out and they have job sections, and there are always a pretty good number of jobs going on. And particularly in that production side of things, I think there will be more and more of that as big, as celebrities or big companies get into it and stuff, and they know, oh, I need professional production. Editing, I know lots of people that do editing, and they seem to be pretty busy because half the time they're having to refer to someone else because they have as many clients as they can handle. So yeah, I think there's a good amount of growth. I mean, I've been with Podbean 6 years, right about 6 years, a little over 6 years. And I mean, our company has expanded tremendously in that amount of time. So, we're all still small tech companies for the most part, agile.
Right.
We're not, 7,000 employees or anything. But we, I think everybody is seeing a lot of growth and different areas. I think there will be, different positions that don't even exist now. And I think we were talking about, at other kinds of media companies, they're going to add podcasting on, so they're going to have a dedicated team. BBC just did a thing where they've been doing podcasts forever, but they just sort of separated it out and created 4 new positions, or sort of restructured, so they see that need to focus and have it, very specific. So all the big radio companies do that.
Right. What do you think about Spotify? I mean, obviously they bought Joe Rogan's podcast, but they're also buying other podcasts, and they're creating their own they're going hard for podcasts. What are you talking about in the industry as far as Spotify? How do you feel about that, and what do you see?
Well, I mean, I feel fairly positive about it. Where it will go exactly, I don't know. I will say that since they came into the industry initially, and we're a pass-through partner with them, so our podcasters get directly on, and so we work with them quite a bit. So it's a collaborative kind of relationship. So I think it's been good because it has definitely brought new listeners in. I know in the podcast group I was running that we'll probably talk about in a bit, we had a lot of people that used Spotify, and they really didn't listen to podcasts before, but they're like, oh, I found this, podcasting section on Spotify. Right. And so it brought new listeners in. And I think it brings in sometimes a younger crowd, or a crowd that's, going there for music. And then But what will happen in terms of, then, I mean, they now own Anchor Hosting, so they have a hosting component, but yet they also work with all of us hosts. So it has gotten to the point in the industry where it's not, it used to be a lot more like siloed, I guess, and now it's more a hodgepodge. And so with them, they have that, and then they are now, buying podcasts, and so they're going to be producing, and so it's, these different things that we used to think of as separate. But again, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's innovation, but I don't know, where that'll land in the end. And I think if companies like that are sort of coming, it depends on sort of how they come in and how they listen or don't listen. I mean, they kind of are doing their own thing in a lot of ways, Spotify, but they have sort of looked at the industry, I think, and they've kind of asked some. I know ever since we were a partner, they had a lot of calls with us, kind of asking us how things worked and those kind of things. And even though obviously there's some areas of our business that are competitive, I feel like, they were wanting to sort of understand, and I think they've done pretty well with it. It's still, an Apple podcast driven game, and like we did our stats roundup for 2019 of all these, different stats from both hosting and the app. And one of the things we said is, Apple's share of markets, there were more downloads percentage-wise. Some other apps went up. And so maybe where Apple was, there aren't the numbers, I don't have them in front of me, but if Apple was 90%, maybe it was 88. But all of them, the numbers went up. So, I mean, it wasn't like Apple was losing ground. It was just that other, like Spotify was having more share, but Apple downloads were also growing. So it's overall been growth on all sides. So that's definitely a positive thing for the industry.
And is it true that Apple's like 70% of the podcast?
Yeah, it's pretty high. All hosts have not all hosts, but some hosts have slightly different, I think, types of podcasts maybe that are with you, but also maybe so for ours, I think our numbers play out a little different for our hosting clients just because our app is pretty strong. And it tends to be, even though our hosting and app don't necessarily, any podcast can be in our app. But our hosted clients tend to use a lot of the stuff. They do the Podbean Lives, they do all that. So they tend to have a bigger share from that. We give them some free promotion. So then obviously they gain more followers there and stuff. So they tend to have, but yeah, Apple is still definitely the big player for sure.
And let's talk internationally, because I've interviewed some people from England, and I've interviewed a guy from Germany who ran an art gallery the other day and had a podcast. Someone told me that this woman, her podcast is named Nurture Your Zest. It's about being creative. Ashley King, and she said that in Europe, the podcasters don't want ads, and they actually go and try and find podcasts that don't have ads because they can't stand the ads in the same way that I can't stand television ads and watch Netflix and Prime. So have you seen that? And then also we'll get into, once you answer that, we'll get into your group in Shanghai, because I'm interested about in China what the feeling was about podcasts. You obviously had a group, so it was popular, but we can talk about those two things.
Yeah, I think I haven't really heard that so much about Europe, but it's not surprising that there's different, different practices and different things. What I do know about Europe and everywhere except for the U.S. basically is that Apple is less popular in most places. So Android phones are more popular in most of the world.
Right.
So that's where there's difference when we look at our stats. If a podcast is based out of, let's say, somewhere in Europe, and they tend to maybe have an audience that's based out there, those numbers are probably going to be different for them because there's going to be more Android phone users. And our app, we have an iOS version, but we're largely Android because, Apple Podcasts is obviously what most people on an Apple phone use, on an iOS device use. But on Android, there's not Google Podcasts has never been so strong, so there's been a lot of room for other apps. As far as ads go, though, I do think, that's what's cool about podcasting is podcasters can do all different kinds of things with it. And one of the things that I think will develop more and more, and speaks to that in some ways in localization, is that with dynamic ad insertion, your ads can be geographically based. And it might be part of the reason why, if Europeans are irritated with ads, it may be partly I mean, partly there's always different cultural things and tolerances, but maybe partly because the ads have traditionally been a lot of American companies and stuff that they can't even get. So I know when I was living abroad, I was like, well, this is great, another mail service that I can't get because they weren't geo-targeting. If it's geo-targeted, I only get ads that are appropriate if I want to target me. And obviously that means they can, provide a service to me. So I think the geo-targeting is nice. I mean, still some people don't want to hear an ad at all, but at least if you hear an ad that could be relevant to you, I think it makes it a lot nicer. So yeah, there's quite a variety as far as, I mean, generally in the world, there's the big, the Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and then all the little individual apps. It's generally similar a lot in the world, but there are some geographically specific. Like India has a big network that's one of the more popular things that's used there. So people still might have used Spotify and other stuff, but it'd be more specific. And there are even beginning to be some hosting platforms that are specific to the area. I mean, I don't necessarily think that's needed unless there's some localized need because it's sort of a worldwide thing. But they may be doing everything in that language, or there may be other reasons why it works well for that. And then there are areas where it's very different, like China.
Yeah.
So China has a whole separate ecosystem for podcasts. A lot of things are blocked that are not held in China. So they have specific media companies that follow the rules there. And so a lot of people there, if you mainly are listening in Chinese, you might use the word podcast, but you might also just know you listen to audiobooks or sort of, I'm trying to think what audio, things. Video consumption is much higher in China, but you have a big population, so it can be. But our podcast Brunch Club was an international group, so we had people from all over, and it's an international group in general, and we were just a chapter, and so everyone listens to the same podcast all around the world for this group. So they were podcasts in English. So we had people again from all over that would come to the meetings, but they were people that were into podcasts, whether that was from traveling abroad or just from discovering them in China. But it's evolving there too, but it's been sort of a lot more paid content there traditionally for the Chinese market. So they have a much bigger tradition of buying content, and more, because of that, it's more focused towards like a learning and development thing, like personal finance or, something that there's a value to purchase. So that's sort of almost a separate thing, but then the just general, like This American Life or, different NPR podcasts or BBC or whatever, people are discovering those more there if they listen in English. And so that's where, like, we would people that would come to the Brunch Club that wanted to discuss that stuff that they had discovered. And we also got a lot of people that would come that just were like, oh, I never listened to podcasts before. I watched videos, but I love going to meetups and discussing things, and I saw this. And I was like, what is this? What's a podcast? And then so we would actually bring in a lot of new podcast listeners.
Cool.
Yeah, but Podcast Brunch Club, it's really cool. If anyone's out there that likes podcasts, I would highly encourage you, just go to podcastbrunchclub.com. A lady named Adela started it, and she is fabulous.
They're in all the different regions?
Yeah, they're on 6 continents. And they're always growing more chapters. Right now, most everyone is doing them virtually, but usually it's an in-person event. So typically every month, what happens is there's a listening list. So it's 3 to 4 podcasts on a certain topic. So this month we're doing conspiracy. So we'll have 4 podcasts on that topic, and everyone listens and then comes to the meeting having listened to hopefully all or most of the podcast. And then there's sort of a set of discussion questions, but the conversation is sort of wide ranging. So it's really a discussion oriented kind of thing, a way to kind of take, podcasting as a lonely medium and make it more of a community thing. So.
Right. So I have so many questions, and we're already at 49 minutes. Do you have to go, or are you?
I'm okay.
Okay. Maybe 10 more minutes. But I'm just really curious about how people listen. So I've had some listeners in India and Europe, Philippines, Japan. So I'm just curious, are they listening in English? I mean, you can't tell me for every country, but in general, or are they having it translated through some app, or
No, usually they're listening in English. I mean,
it's
it's
just in
possible
English?
you could, yeah. Now, what's happening now with podcasts making this, the podcasts are making this decision. Podcasts are now localizing and translating or providing transcripts, but generally people don't do it, anything like that, through an app. So usually it's like they're either seeking it out through just Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or it might be on some local platform, but it's sort of the English section if it's an international one. So. But you got to remember, English is the most spoken language in the world as far as a first, second, third, fourth language, if you not the primary language. So there's a lot of people, a lot of consumers.
Right, right.
So,
And
uh,
and as far as the conferences, like, would you say they're all very similar in the sense of that there's, a meet and greet and there's networking at night, but really during the day there's either speakers or classes? Is that how it's set up in general?
yeah, mostly. They also have a lot of networking opportunities all weaving throughout the event. So most of them there will be like we're often working at a booth. So there's an expo type of area, and that's an area where you can go around and find out. Oh, yeah, I've been thinking about hiring an editor. I want to know more about different microphones than what I'm using now, and those companies are all there. So there's that. But then also at that you get a lot of just general mixing and mingling. So there's a lot of that, but they tend to have classes or speakers during the day. Everything from sometimes the keynotes, which may be more of a, my story or something, kind of interesting, through more class. And then a lot of them do sort of mini, either pre sessions where it's a whole day or a couple days, or like mini cons where it's focused on a specific niche or something like that.
Very cool. All right. Well, what kind of advice I mean, obviously you would say go to Podbean and sign up, but what kind of advice would you give to people who are newer podcasts, who are thinking about doing podcasts, that, what would you say to people as far as podcasting goes? What would be your advice since you've been around it so much?
Yeah, I would say a couple things. I mean, first of all, know why you want to do it. What is going to be special about what you're going to do. And it doesn't have to mean that no one's ever done it before. Maybe it's just your individual voice, is you think brings something special or whatever. But think about why mostly. Make sure you listen to some podcasts. I think that's brilliant. You don't have to have already been a longtime fan, but listen to some to see, and search around to see what's out there, because if you think you have a totally unique concept, there might be something like it out there, which could be fine, but you want to know that. And join Facebook groups if you're on Facebook for podcasting. We have one called Podcasting Smarter, but there's a lot out there. There's a lot of that hive mind that you can tap into without having to pay for courses or things like that up front. Podbean also does free webinars, so it's podbean.com/webinars. And some of them are about Podbean stuff, but a lot of them are more broad. So we just launched one about how to start a podcast. Right. And we also have about how to record. And it gets into this stuff that if you haven't done a lot of this kind of stuff before, you're, getting thrown into this world of which type of microphone do I need? What's this thing about the direction of the microphone and all of these patterns? And, I don't, what is this? So Don, who's one of our marketing colleagues who loves the technology and the mics and all that stuff, and he's a music guy, gets into it, but we do it in a way where it's not totally overwhelming. I mean, you could teach a week-long course. So those are all free. And then there's a lot of resources out there, which like the groups are great to connect with if you want to do a more in-depth, like if this is very new to you and you really want to do a full launching course or that kind of thing. So there's plenty, but it can really be done simply, at least to start. I think the most important thing is that you know why you want to do it and what the content is going to bring that's special. And then from there, you don't have to have the fanciest equipment necessarily. That's something you can always upgrade, but just so many people go to conferences, for example. I've seen people there, for years, and they're still thinking about starting. So,
wow,
yeah,
some people need a little push.
Yeah, so sometimes, and a lot of the conferences have things where they'll do a contest where they'll help with getting the information instead of getting ready to, and say, okay, it's going to be 6 weeks and you're going to launch. We're going to be an accountability group and things like that, where they'll have a start your podcast day for people that want to start. So they can be a good way. And now a lot of those are virtual. So if you're not going to anything, or maybe don't want to spend the money and time traveling, hopefully some of that virtual stuff will continue, so that
Right.
there's those things too.
Yeah, I don't want to say I don't want to get into Anchor because it's like a competitor, but like as far as recording on your phone, what would you say about that? But let me just mention something first. So this guy from the True Consequences podcast, he had a woman. He gets something like 30,000 downloads an episode, but a woman who was much more experienced than him and had a million downloads, 500,000 an episode, contacted him and said, "Listen, you're doing a great job. It sounds amazing. I mean, the stories are amazing, but you need better quality because people aren't going to listen if there's buzzing and fuzzing." And he said it was the greatest advice he ever got. And now, he wears the headphone, he uses the mic, he uses the cover thing, whatever you call it. What would you say about that to people who are just, because you want to do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
You want to just start and do it. And it might be good if that's all you can do. I've interviewed people who it's like, all I do is the phone and that's it. But if you can improve the quality eventually, or start with some improved quality, it is a good idea.
Yeah, and the problem is that sometimes, like nowadays, it's easier nowadays. So we also have an app on our phone. We have a phone recorder in the app that allows you to just record in the app. And we also have the live streaming I talked about, but a lot of people use the unlisted mode of live streaming to record with guests. So it's a way to do it. And the quality is so different than what it was like back when I was starting to listen to podcasts. You really had to have the microphone and the stuff. You can still use a microphone with your phone.
Right.
That's what I would recommend.
Right.
Definitely, I would not recommend. We've talked about this. I wouldn't recommend using computer speakers without a headset or something.
Right.
But a lot of times a headset can be quite good. I mean, you need and then the thing I would say that people sometimes misunderstand is they'll buy a mic and sometimes they don't know what kind of mic they're buying. They don't know how to use it properly, and they don't have the room set up in the way that accommodates that mic. So they can spend money but still not make it better. And then
Right.
you could have a person using their phone but maybe using better technique and being in a room that's not got a lot of noise and that could do just as well. So one of the things in a lot of our articles and our webinar that we point out are those other things that if you don't do those, it's not going to be good, even if you have something
Right.
good, probably. But if you, if you can start building the pieces. But there's good microphones for not a lot also. So it can be, all of this can be done, and good mics for the phone, good audio recorders. So there's a lot of different options. So many that sometimes it becomes overwhelming.
Yeah,
but
it's a lot.
I think, and I think the thing is to test it out and to listen back to what it sounds like, because you might get good quality using a certain tool, and then other people are, you might be using the tools incorrectly. So listen back and see, like, if I were listening to this, would it be, for me, one of the worst things is if it's got too much variable sound or it's really too quiet, because I always listen when I walk or commute. And so I used to tell people the only reason I usually stop listening is if it has a lot of what you were talking about, buzzing and annoying kind of noises in there. Sounds like they're in a wind tunnel. Unless they're saying I'm outside, I'm doing this for a specific reason, then maybe but if I just couldn't hear it, and that would have been easy to identify. I don't know how you couldn't have listened to your podcast and known, wait a minute, someone's not going to be able to hear this.
Right. This doesn't sound good.
I have it on volume 10 and I still can't. That's what I have it all the way up.
Yeah.
And in the Podbean app, we have a noise or a volume boost. And I always have that on. But even these podcasts, I couldn't hear still with that.
Wow.
So just listening and having a feel. And then, some simple post-production can make a big difference. So either learning the basic editing, there's free tools, or getting an editor if that's just something you hate.
Yeah.
It can be worthwhile.
I've definitely read in the podcast groups or heard stories of people who literally they have little kids and they have dogs and they have neighbors and they go into their closet with all these blankets and record their podcast in this little hole basically so they can get some silence. I heard one guy recorded in his car because it was the only quiet place in his neighborhood. in the garage. So yeah, I mean, people do whatever they have to do. But Shannon, this has been great. I could talk to you all day. Maybe we'll do a part two sometime because I have a million questions and you've answered all of them so well, and I have a million more. But this has been a lot of fun, and thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, thank you. It was great.
Very cool. All right. Well, keep in touch, and I definitely want to hear more about the conferences and all that. So, where are the places that you've got the Facebook group, Podcasting Smarter,
Yeah. And we also have a podcast called Podcasting Smarter.
right? So people could listen to that, and then
Yeah.
on Facebook with the Smarter, you'll announce different events and different conferences, or is that somewhere else?
Yeah, we usually share that there, and or our just our Podbean page, which is Podbean.com on Facebook and Twitter and all
Right.
that stuff. So we usually share some of that stuff. Yeah.
Very cool. Thanks so much. You have a great day.
All right, you too. Bye bye.
All right. Thank you.